FBI Special Agent Robert Hilland was a self-described no-nonsense, follow-the-facts guy. Exactly the last type of person that you would expect to consult with a psychic. But after reaching a dead end on a case that consumed his life, a skeptical Hilland turned to psychic medium John Edward. A life-changing meeting led to a 25-year working and personal relationship between the FBI agent and psychic. As Hilland consulted with Edward, supernatural forces paired with the FBI agent's sharp gut instincts served as guiding lights in a variety of cases. Joining Forbes True Crime is former Special Agent Hilland, co-author of Chasing Evil, a book he co-wrote with John Edward about their unlikely story. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis. I'm one of the hosts of Forbes TV. Joining me now is former FBI Special Agent and co-author of Chasing Evil, Robert Hilland. Special Agent Hilland, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm excited to talk about your book because I could not put it down. It's called Chasing Evil. It's co-authored by your friend John Edward and yourself, and it talks about how your relationship really is intertwined, right? You are an FBI agent, you work in law enforcement, and you're working with a psychic privately for 25 years. And you now say John Edward is like a brother to you, but at first you were wary of his psychic abilities. At one point you're listening to him on the radio, giving a reading, you call him to yourself a con man. But then one thing changes everything. And I want to read a description that you wrote. You call yourself a no-nonsense, follow-the-facts guy. I was brought up in church and did not subscribe to superstition, hocus pocus, or the supernatural. So that really sounds like the exact opposite of someone who would work with a psychic. Talk to us about how you found yourself in John Edward's office.
Yeah, so to your point, I was working in the FBI New York office at the time. I was previously a police officer in Jersey, and I had a very significant caseload, and I had just taken on this new case of this John Smith that you referred to. And I lived in Jersey, commuted every day, and I would hear him on the radio, and I was mortified, thinking, how can people be so foolish as to believe this? It felt like some kind of con, and how gullible could people be? And I would shut the radio off, and then I would hear him a week or two later, and this kept on. And I had this particular case that I referred to, and I was looking at 25 years of investigative efforts by multiple agencies. There weren't a lot of things that they missed in that case. And then one day I was driving in and I heard him, and I had this visceral response. And I called his office, and all I told them was, my name is Bob Hilland from the FBI. I work on a squad investigating cold cases and missing people. And I was wondering if John would meet with me. So that was the premise. I went there either to expose him, which is really what I thought I was going to reveal, that this guy was not really who represent himself to be. Or worst case scenario, maybe he would be able to help us with something in the case.
And I want to talk about that case that you went to him for. It was the case of John Smith. At the time, John Smith had 2 missing wives. This case almost cost you your job. It was career defining. It stuck with you for decades. And your journey with John Smith in particular, that spanned decades as well, because you first laid eyes on him, or rather, should I say, locked eyes with him in 1991 when you were a cop in New Jersey. Can you talk to us about A, that first meeting, and B, why did this case, this particular one, stick with you for so many years?
Well, in 1991, I was a young police officer in this small town called West Windsor Township Police Department. They had less than 100 cops there. And I remember that night because, you pay attention to things. And, when I saw him that night, another officer was taking the complaint. He just stood out to me. There was something about him, and looking back, it has different context, but he was a weird guy, and he certainly drew my attention. But to your question, many years later, in 1997, I'm now in the FBI working, of all things, cold case murders, and I happen to be pulled back to my old department. I meet with the detective, just having coffee with the guy, catching up, and I see the case, and I said, hey, whatever happened with that case? I was very familiar with it. I didn't work it. I did not investigate it. And he said, hey, listen, it's dead in the water. There's no evidence here. We can't prove the case.
And that wasn't the last time you heard that this case is dead in the water. There's no evidence. It's a dead end here. You should just give it up. But in your meeting with John Edward, this is what he said, because the way you first describe it in your first meeting, it really sent a chill up my spine. He warned you that nothing about this case was going to be easy, and this is what he said. You are a man of extremes. There's no middle ground in your world. You will make it your mission to get this guy at all costs. That could mean your personal life, your family, your status at work, whatever, and that you will be tested in ways you cannot imagine. Hearing that, some people would run for the hills, especially because he did call this a battle between good versus evil. Did that make you more determined to stay on this case?
Great question. I think his characterization was right as a young guy. Every strength represents a weakness on the other side. So I was a guy like a dog with a bone. I could not let my cases go. They were very important to me, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't let anyone down. And so now I had my former police department who was asking for help. I had the family members of these victims. I had the victims themselves. And there was reason to believe, were there other victims out there? So I don't know that it was in me, certainly at that early stage of my life, to walk away from this case. So I mean, I don't mean to sound full of hubris, but no was not an option for me at that point.
And no was not an option for you time and time again, even when your superiors were essentially saying, Bob, it's enough. You have to get off this case. They're moving you off the case. You're working it nonstop. You're working it in off hours. And you would consult with John Edward on this time and time again for years. And I want to talk about how specifically you used that information, because sometimes it made no sense at the time, the information he was giving to you. And he would always tell you essentially follow your instincts. And you said you used it as a compass. Talk to us about how you would let his information from his spirit guides guide you in the direction of your cases.
Yeah, well, from that very first meeting, now we knew from looking at the reports, again, there were probably 8 or 10 officers through the years who had worked this. And, there's what's written in the reports, and then there's things that are not necessarily captured in the reports. And that you only get that from talking to those former investigators. So I had heard maybe a couple investigators when I was educating myself say, you know what, I have my suspicions that Michael may know something. And they would just describe their feelings on it. In the very first meeting with John, after we went through the first, 30 minutes of him laser focused on some of the things he provided, he said, wait a minute, who's Michael? Now, we told him nothing about this case. He didn't know John Smith. He didn't know the case was from Jersey. He just knew I was an FBI agent from New York. He asked who Michael was. And I told him Michael was a brother of our subject. And he says, Michael knows what happened. You need to get to Michael. He told us that. He also very, very vividly described a wooden box on the side of the road. He described it being down in a ravine. He described seeing a line of police officers, and he was befuddled because he was like, what are you doing here? You have this victim already. And he's going to great length where he describes a newspaper article, which the headlines were Girl in the Box. At this point, we have no idea what he's referring to. And later on, all that proved to be true. It was his other wife. It was the other victim in the case.
And I'm curious because, like we've been saying, you got a lot of dead ends in this case. There wasn't a lot of evidence initially. Did either the information from John's spirit guides or later one of the other wives, the second wife, Fran Smith, did her, let's just say, energy, did that help you keep going in pursuing this case and pursuing some sense of justice here?
I think the answer is probably so, but it wasn't the case that John never gave me evidence. He was, like you said, a compass to direct me to the evidence. And, at first, as you said, I'm a man of logic and evidence. And when John was providing this information that was so specific, so singular, things that he shouldn't have known, it was undeniable. And that forced me to try to ask him more questions, how could this guy know this? And it wasn't the case where he said, hey, X marks the spot. It's, hey, look for these signs, or here's people that can take you there. And that's how I met him on this case. And as you know, it led to the next case and the next case and the next case.
And to that point, I mean, based on what you've written in this book with John Edward, if you were still an FBI agent, if something happened to me, I would want you on the case because you have these killer gut instincts. And that paired with what John is saying to you, talk to us about that because that has saved your life more than once, you write. Because John will sometimes call you and say, hey, be careful of this, be wary of this. And then you just have these gut instincts that are on the mark each time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I would hope that the majority of good investigators have that gut feeling. And I think over my many years, I learned how to trust that more often. And then John gave me that heightened sense of things to look for. And sometimes he would tell me things that made absolutely no sense at the time. And I would say, what are you talking about? And later on, that, if you want to call it a sign or a symbol, would appear. And you say to yourself, am I imagining this? Is this like am I making this up? Am I creating something here? But it's simply, the book was not written, I just want to be clear, it wasn't written to convince anybody of John Edward. I am the biggest skeptic of all. My colleagues will tell you that. And some of them are in this book. They have been interviewed for this book. If somebody came to me, but from my own experience with John, and said to me, hey, Bob, you know what? I got this friend, he's a psychic. I would say, get out of here. What are you doing talking to psychics? But for the circumstances bringing us together, I would not have believed any of this. And I probably would laugh at the story.
And so then you bring him on because you're at this dead end with the John Smith case. John Smith ends up long road, but he's behind bars. And
Right.
You're at a point wondering, hey, how is our relationship going to evolve, right? Was that it for John and I working together as psychic and FBI agent? And he described that in a past life, you were like Sherlock Holmes and Watson. So talk to us about how that relationship evolved, because to your point, if it was anyone else, you'd say, get out of here for working with a psychic. You worked with him privately for 25 years.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that our relationship grew organically. It wasn't like I was all in with this guy. I was very, very leery and skeptical. Even after that first meeting of him, it was like my world was turned upside down. I was trying to make sense of it. But to your question, I don't know that I ever thought of where does my relationship with him go, because as things happened, he started talking about other cases that I wasn't even asking him about. Like little things would be said and I would say, what are you talking about? And then it would click on me, wait a minute, he's talking about something else. That's how it kind of progressed.
And I mean, just reading this, I know that you said it in your book that you are a no nonsense, stick by the fact, logic and reasoning guy, but that's the vibe I got from you when reading this book. And you eventually become an expert at polygraph examinations. So you can sit across from someone and you know they're lying. This happened in a few cases. You knew that's the guy, you know someone's lying. I mean, talk to us about that. How hard or how easy is it to sit across from someone and be able to read them really in a matter of seconds?
You know, I think you're giving me too much credit, right? I'm grateful for your comments, but with experience, you develop that. And I don't think I'm alone in that. But I think anytime you're going to interview or interrogate somebody, you don't just walk in there cold, right? You've done your homework, right? The investigative facts are what they are. So you need to talk to this person to determine whether the story they're telling you aligns with the evidence or it doesn't. And then oftentimes people are reluctant to tell you the truth. And that's the hard part of a job of a polygraph examiner, especially when somebody fails a test in a criminal case, is to create the atmosphere where somebody feels comfortable talking to you and revealing difficult information that very likely will put them in jail sometimes for the rest of their lives.
But the polygraph team did say you have a knack for getting information out of people. And as a journalist, that's my dream, right? I just want to squeeze as much information out of people as possible. So how do you do it?
Well, I don't think it's a simple answer. I think you have to tailor your communication, your interview style to the person that you're speaking with, right? The more you know about the person, the better you can tailor how you're going to talk to them. The more knowledgeable you are about the case facts, the better you are. But it's not just one thing. It's not just, nonverbal behavior or verbal behavior in and of itself. It's a combination of those factors. It's what they say, how they say it, the tenses of the verbs they use, what they omit, coupled with stress, right? How their body changes and in relation to stress. And sometimes you have to be discerning because innocent people will be stressed, and you have to work through that because they're, as an FBI agent, it is equally important to exonerate an innocent person as it is to identify the guilty person. So I never walked into those rooms saying, this is the guy, because sometimes I was faced with a situation, I think one is in the book, where I was led to believe this is the person, and it wasn't. So I have an equal responsibility to the innocent people as I do to those who are involved in crimes.
And then just to go back to that John Smith case, when you go and sit with him initially, when you first locked eyes with him, you said he had eyes of a shark. I mean, those were eyes of a killer. You saw some real evil in there. Going in and talking to him at first, when did you realize, you know what, I think that this is the guy?
Well, to be candid, I think reading through 25 years of investigative reports and the inconsistencies with his stories over the years, and as it conflicted with the known evidence, I think it was rather obvious that he was not being honest with the previous investigators. So I think it's fair to say that logic would dictate that this man is not being truthful about what happened with his former wives. I don't think that was anything magical. I think anybody with common sense, when you read the reports, would arrive at that conclusion. So it wasn't a reach on any part, right?
And when you first met with John Edward, he said to you, he doesn't want this relationship to be public. It has to be off the record, whatever you both work with. Now, 25 years later, you co-authored a book. Why now? Why is now the time to be public with that relationship and detail all of the times you worked together?
Yeah, well, I think the obvious question is, now I'm retired. I'm on to my next career. So there's that. And many years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago, I had written, it was almost just like a cathartic thing, almost like journaling. I had written about my experiences with John as it pertained to the Smith case. And I didn't have a reason, like I wasn't going to publish it. I just kind of did it just to kind of process it, I guess. And then as there were some other cases where actually John said, hey, maybe we should tell our story. And I said, yeah, I don't think so. But then at the end, when I retired, I said, you know what, we certainly have been through a journey together. This might be an interesting story. So it just felt like the stars aligned and the timing was right. And here we are. It's hard to believe it was 1998 when I met him. That's quite a while ago.
And the journey, it really reads like this should be a movie. I mean, it's just fascinating what you both were working on. And I am curious, because of your relationship with John Edward, did that change your perspective at all as a law enforcement officer?
Great question. I think as a young guy, the word was black and white to me, right? It was one or the other. And I think a lot of people are like that. It's one category or another. But I think with age and experience, hopefully comes some degree of wisdom, and you start to realize there's some gray areas. But specifically, John helped me to understand the importance of being open to things and questioning our assumptions. Whereas before, I wish I could talk to myself that day going in to see him and have that conversation with myself, because I have certainly evolved in how I view things, the world, and spirituality, things of that nature. It's not just what we see right here. There's more to this.
And do you think any of the cases, because your book doesn't just outline the Smith case, it does dive very deeply into that, but it talks about other cases that you were working on. Do you think without that relationship, there would be a different outcome in any of those cases?
I think for sure, certainly in a few of them, absolutely. They wouldn't have come together the way they did, if at all. And there's one case the book opens up with a little boy who was missing. His name was Noah. And the crazy part about that story was the location where his body was found had already previously been searched by investigators and had been checked off. And John took me back there. So, I mean, in the long run, months, years later, would the body have been found? Maybe, I don't know. But to your question, yeah, absolutely. The information that John provided me absolutely helped in many of these cases.
And I know that you wrote this after you're retired now, and that's part of the reason why now's the time to share the story. But is it commonplace for FBI agents or other law enforcement officials to work with psychics, or at least consult them privately?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is probably no. And the reason for that is we are limited in our resources and our time. There's a time element to all of our cases. And we deal in the world of investigative leads and witnesses and suspects and physical evidence. So we typically don't have time to deal with psychics. I'm not trying to disparage John or anybody out there that may have some ability. That's just a reality. And but for the circumstances of John and I coming together, I wouldn't have got with him. There's an old story, and it's true. It was a case, I think, out of Texas. It was a missing person. They had a tip line set up. And, I can't even begin to tell you how chaotic that can be. You got a lot of people working the case looking for this person. Tips are coming in. And the supervisor goes over to this agent and says, hey, we've got 5 people here that claim to be psychics. They have information about where this person may be. And that the agent picks up the phone and calls the first number. And the person on the other end says, hello, who is this? And the agent hangs up and writes, not psychic, right? So I think the nature of being an investigator, you need healthy skepticism to be successful. You must be skeptical because oftentimes as an investigator, even the things you see at a crime scene don't tell the real story. We have to be diligent about cognitive bias. We can't create a narrative that may or may not fit. So to your question, John was an absolute asset. Do I think law enforcement's actively involving themselves in psychics? If they are, it's for dead cases. It's for cold cases where all avenues have been exhausted, right? Those are the types of cases they would consult with a psychic with when there's no stone that has been unturned and they've exhausted everything.
Well, this book, like I said, I could not put it down. And it talks about that relationship with John Edward. It also talks about you and how your work really took you around the world, and you were in pretty perilous circumstances. Bob, where can people find the book?
Really, anywhere you want to buy books. You can go to Barnes and Noble's. You just Google it. There's a million places that are selling the book. So there's not one source. You can get it anywhere. And there'll be, of course, an audio book as well. It's released next week, I think September 2nd.
Well, Bob Hilland, author of Chasing Evil, co-author with John Edward, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you for having me.